It was a Saturday morning in early October when everything I thought I knew about my life started to unravel. I remember it clearly because I'd just gotten back from my usual walk around the neighborhood. The kind of walk I take when I need to clear my head before a long weekend of catching up on work. I'm a cardiovascular surgeon, and weekends don't always mean rest for me. I came through the front door, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table. My wife, Audrey, was still upstairs. I could hear her moving around, the familiar creak of the floorboards above my head. We'd been married for 19 years. 19 years. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you the rest of this. It means I knew the sound of her laugh before she even opened her mouth. It means I knew she cried at insurance commercials, but not at funerals. She said funerals made her feel numb, like her body was protecting her from the weight of it. It means I knew she took her coffee with oat milk and half a packet of raw sugar, that she kept a running list of books she intended to read but rarely got past the third chapter, that she snored softly on her left side but denied it every single time I mentioned it. 19 years is a long time to know someone, or to think you do. Her name is Audrey. We met when I was a second-year resident, and she was working as a pharmaceutical sales rep, sharp, funny, quick with a comeback. She had a way of walking into a room and recalibrating the whole energy of it. I fell hard and fast, which was unlike me. I was 31 years old, running on 4 hours of sleep most days, and somehow she made it all feel manageable. We got married the following spring. Our daughter Kelsey was born 2 years later. Our son, Drew, came 4 years after that. By the time this story takes place, Kelsey was 17 and Drew was 13. Good kids, smart kids. The kind of kids who made you feel like maybe you'd done something right. Audrey had a group of friends from her early pharmaceutical days. Women she'd stayed close with over the years. The kind of friendships held together by group chats and the Fipoje Girls Earl weekend. 3 of them had done significantly better financially than we had. Not that we were struggling. On a surgeon's salary, we were comfortable. But these women had married into serious money. One of them, a woman named Cassandra, had a husband who ran a regional logistics empire. Another, Portia, was married to a hedge fund manager. The third was Jenna, whose husband had sold a tech startup about 6 years back and hadn't worked since. Every year or so, they'd take a trip together. A long weekend in Nashville, a week in Sedona. Last spring, they decided to go to Croatia for 10 days. Dubrovnik, Hvar, Split. Audrey came home from that trip glowing. She said it was the most beautiful place she'd ever been. 2 months later, she told me she was pregnant. I need you to sit with that for a second. 19 years of marriage. Our youngest child was 13 years old. We had talked, genuinely talked, about the fact that we were done having children. Audrey had been on the same prescription for years. I want you to understand how completely unprepared I was for those words. She told me on a Tuesday night, after the kids were in bed. We were cleaning up the kitchen together, which we always did. It was one of those small rituals that I'd come to associate with the quiet comfort of being married a long time. She dried a pan, set it down on the stove, and turned to me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to stay calm. Doctors are trained to stay calm. It's almost a reflex. So I leaned against the counter and I waited. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was the kind that has a texture to it. I looked at her. She was looking at the floor. How far along? I heard myself ask. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. About 9 weeks. I didn't say anything for a long moment. 9 weeks. I was running the math involuntarily, the way you do when your brain is trying to protect you from a conclusion it's already reached. 9 weeks put conception somewhere in early August. Audrey had come back from Croatia in mid-July. Audrey, I said slowly. We haven't. I know, she said. She still wasn't looking at me. That was all she said. 2 words. I know. I think I set down the dish towel I was holding. I think I walked to the other side of the kitchen and stood at the window looking out at the backyard, at the dark lawn, and the old oak tree we'd planted when Kelsey was born. I don't actually remember what I did next. What I remember is the feeling. This profound, disorienting stillness, like the floor had shifted 2 inches to the left and I was the only one who'd noticed. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't ask her who. Not that night. I went upstairs, looked in on Drew, then Kelsey, both asleep. I stood in the doorway of each room for longer than I needed to. Then I went to the guest room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a very long time. Over the next 3 days, we had the conversation in pieces. She admitted it had happened during the Croatia trip. She said it was a mistake. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been in a strange headspace, that she'd felt invisible lately, that I was always working, that she hadn't meant for it to happen. I listened to all of it. I let her talk, because I've learned, over a long career of delivering bad news to families, that you have to let people say to say before you can say anything useful back. What I didn't tell her in those first 3 days was that I had already made my decision. I just needed more information before I acted on it. On the 4th day, I called my attorney. His name is Ken, and we'd been friends since college, long before he became one of the best family law attorneys in the state. I did not tell Audrey I'd made the call. I went to his office during a lunch break, and we talked for 90 minutes. At the same time, I started quietly documenting things. Not in a dramatic way. I wasn't tailing anyone or hiring investigators, but I'm a detail-oriented person by nature and by profession, and I started paying attention to things I'd previously let wash over me. The frequency with which a particular name came up, the way Audrey's phone screen always happened to be face down when I walked into the room. Small things. The kind of thing you file away and forget when you trust someone and notice immediately when you don't. About a week after Audrey told me about the pregnancy, she called Cassandra. I could hear one side of the conversation from the hallway, and I heard her say a name, Conrad. Conrad was Portia's husband. I went back to my office and sat down and stared at the wall for about 10 minutes. Then I went back to work, because I had patients who needed me, and there was nothing else I could do with that information right then. Conrad and Portia had been married for 14 years. They had twin boys who were 8 years old. Portia was one of Audrey's closest friends. She'd been in our wedding. She'd held Kelsey in the hospital the day she was born. I had spent more hours than I could count, sitting across from Conrad at dinner tables and backyard barbecues, talking about football and mortgage rates, and the general exhaustion of raising children. He was one of those men who laughed a little too loud at his own jokes. I had never particularly warmed to him, but I'd had no reason to distrust him either. Now I had every reason. I requested a paternity test. Not through a hospital. I didn't want any of this anywhere near my professional life, but through a private lab that handles these exactly the circumstances I was in. I told Audrey it was something I needed, and to her credit, she didn't refuse. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Okay." That was it. The results came back 11 days later. I already knew what they were going to say. I just needed the paper. During those 11 days, I did something I'd never done in 19 years of marriage. I had Audrey's name removed from 3 of our joint financial accounts. Not our household account. I left that untouched so the kids' routines wouldn't be disrupted. But 2 investment accounts, and 1 savings account that I had built almost entirely through my own earnings before and during our marriage. I spoke to Ken about the prenuptial agreement we'd signed. It wasn't ironclad, but it was solid, and it covered exactly this kind of scenario. Adultery. It was right there in the language. I also called our accountant and our financial planner and had them begin pulling together documentation I'd need. I did this systematically over several weeks without telling Audrey, not because I was trying to deceive her. I was going to be entirely transparent when the time came, but because I needed to have everything in order before the conversation happened. I've seen too many people in crisis situations act before they think, and I'd spent enough years watching colleagues make catastrophic decisions under emotional pressure. I was not going to be one of those people. When the paternity results confirmed what I already knew, I printed the document and put it in a folder. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat Audrey down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd told me she was pregnant, and I put the folder in front of her. She opened it. She looked at the results. She didn't say anything. "I want you to know," I said, "that I'm not angry." That wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough for what I needed to communicate. What I am is finished. I've already spoken to Ken. I'll have papers drawn up. I'd like to do this as quietly as possible for the kids. She started crying. I never meant for any of this. I know, I said. I believe you. That doesn't change what happened. She asked me what the plan was, whether she could stay in the house while we figured things out. I told her she could stay for 30 days while she made arrangements. I'd sleep in the guest room. We'd maintain the appearance of normal for the kids till we were ready to tell them together. She asked about money. I told her what the prenup covered and what it didn't. She'd be entitled to a portion of appreciation on the marital home and a modest amount of spousal support for a transitional period, given that she'd stepped back from full-time work when Drew was born. She would not be receiving half of my retirement accounts or either of the investment accounts. She would be receiving enough to get on her feet. That was all. She looked like she wanted to argue. And then she looked at the folder still sitting on the table between us, and she didn't. The conversation with the kids was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than telling a family their father didn't make it off the table. Harder than anything, Kelsey cried. Drew got very quiet, which scared me more. I told them that this was not about anything they had done, that both of us loved them, that nothing in their day-to-day life was going to change more than was absolutely necessary. I told them the truth, that sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people, and that when that happens, families change shape. That was as close as I got to specifics. What I did not tell them, and still have not, and hope I never have to, is what those specific choices were. Audrey moved out at the end of November. She found an apartment about 12 minutes from the house, which I thought was the right call. The kids needed access to both of us. She offered me the same access to her apartment whenever the kids were there. We were, in the wreckage of what we'd been, trying to do this right. About a week before Audrey moved out, I found out that Portia knew. I didn't hear it from Portia. I heard it from my friend Marcus, who had a loose connection to that social circle and mentioned, not knowing the full story, that Portia and Conrad were having some kind of crisis. I called Portia directly. She picked up after 3 rings, and I could tell from the first syllable that she already knew why I was calling. We talked for 45 minutes. She was broken, is the word that comes closest. She'd found out about Conrad and Audrey 2 weeks after I had, when Conrad, apparently racked with guilt, had told her himself. She was in the middle of her own divorce proceedings. She told me the Croatia trip had been the first time it happened, and that as far as she knew, it had only been those 10 days. I believed her. I don't know why. Maybe because she had nothing to gain from lying to me. We haven't spoken since that conversation. I don't know what I would have said, and I think she felt the same way. We were both casualties of the same disaster, and sometimes shared damage doesn't build connection. It just reminds you of everything you lost. The divorce was finalized 8 months after Audrey moved out. Ken was thorough and patient, and the process was about as clean as these things can be. The prenup held. The house is mine. The kids live with me during the school week and go to Audrey's on weekends, with flexibility around schedules and holidays. We use an app for co-parenting communication. We are civil to each other. We are probably more civil than we were in the last few years of the marriage, which tells you something. Audrey had the baby in early spring. A girl. I know her name because Kelsey told me. I didn't ask. I have no relationship with that child, and I think it's appropriate that I don't. She is innocent in all of this. I want to be clear about that. But she is not a part of my life, and trying to make her one would be a kind of fiction that wouldn't serve anyone. Drew is doing better than I expected. He's in therapy, which we both agreed to start within a month of telling the kids. He talks more now than he used to, which his therapist says is a good sign. He's taken up woodworking in the garage on Saturday mornings, just the two of us, and we build things and talk about nothing important, and sometimes talk about important things, and I think that is exactly the right amount of everything. Kelsey turned 18 last spring. She's applying to colleges now, pre-med, which she arrived at entirely on her own, and which I tried not to react to with too much enthusiasm, because I didn't want her to think I was steering her. She told me one night, when we were driving home from a campus visit, that she was proud of how I'd handled everything. I had to keep my eyes on the road for a moment before I could respond to that. I didn't always handle it well, I told her. You didn't fall apart, she said. That counts for something. Maybe it does. I don't know that I'd give myself that much credit. There were nights in that first winter when I sat alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning and tried to understand how 19 years could have a gap in them large enough for a whole secret life to fit through. I don't think I ever arrived at an answer that satisfied me. I think at some point I stopped needing one. I'm not going to tell you I've moved on because I'm not entirely sure what moving on means. My life looks different than it did 2 years ago. There's a quietness to the house on weekends when the kids are at Audrey's that I used to find crushing, and now I've started filling it with things I'd neglected. Reading again, running longer routes, a cooking class I took on a whim last winter and actually enjoyed. Small things, the reclaiming of a self that had gotten a little lost in the scaffolding of a life that's no longer standing. I'll say this. I do not regret how I handled the business side of things. I took my time. I thought before I acted. I protected what I'd built. Not out of vengeance, but out of a belief that what happened had consequences, and consequences are how we signal to each other. And to ourselves. That choices mean something. But the other stuff, the part that isn't accounts and legal documents and co-parenting apps, that's slower going. There are moments, usually in the middle of something mundane, when the loss hits in a way that's almost physical. Not for the marriage exactly. I'd made my peace with the ending of that, but for the version of the future I'd been living toward without realizing it. The retirement we'd planned in some vague, not yet real way. The grandchildren we hadn't talked about but had somehow assumed. The particular shape of growing old with someone who knew every version of you. I grieve that version of the future sometimes. I let myself do it, and then I drive Drew to his woodworking supply run, or I look at the college spreadsheet Kelsey and I built together, or I take my long Saturday morning walk and notice that the oak tree we planted in the backyard has gotten enormous, and I think that maybe what I'm building now isn't a consolation prize. Maybe it's just the next thing. That has to be enough. For now it is.